January 29th, Monday. About -5°C, windy, cold, overcast.
Gábor Stéló,
35-year-old evangelical pastor. In the autumn of 1944, with the support of the International Red Cross and the assistance of the Good Shepherd Mission Organization, he established 32 orphanages for persecuted people in just a few weeks. Location: Laurentfi Street, District 2, Buda. We heard Russian voices around the house. We had discussed beforehand that if the Russians came, Kovai would immediately say there were children here. It was a special gift from God that he, a Russian-speaking communist writer, had been sent to us. We had just grabbed our clothes when we heard a louder movement, shouting overhead. Then a big explosion blew the cellar door off and a strong gunpowder smoke poured in. I quickly jumped to the door's place and shouted to Kovai to speak out in Russian. With all his might, he shouted, "Tavaris! There is a children's home here." Meanwhile, a Soviet soldier appeared in the doorway with a gun pointed, a white sheet on his shoulder. The cellar was completely lit up. We lit all the candles and matches. When the soldier saw us, he took a deep breath, pushed his fur cap up to the top of his head and smiled. He said something. Kovai answered. Then our soldier turned outward and shouted something to those outside, and 3 or 4 more soldiers came down the stairs. They approached us friendly and calmly, and with Kovai's translation, they asked for sheets and pillowcases to make snowcoats. The women immediately took apart some pillowcases and tied some sheets together. Shots were heard from outside. Then they snatched the half-finished snow sheets from the women's hands and rushed out to storm the neighboring house. We were just about to eat when a young officer came down to the cellar looking for men to do a bit of work. He took almost all the men, even the older boys, leaving only the old caretaker behind. He led them to the garden of the house behind us, where a small 2-wheeled cannon was stationed. The officer gestured wildly, explaining that we were to move it to our garden. So we set to it, pushing it through the deep snow. It was pretty easy going, only getting stuck at the collapsed iron fence, but we managed to get it through and wanted to leave it there. The officer just pointed, indicating further, and pointed to the small street running alongside. "Okay, we'll push it further." No problem yet, we were under the cover of the villa. But as soon as we got out into the street, we came under German machine gun fire. 6 of us were pushing the cannon and we ran across the street with it. Suddenly, St. Mikloshi, a Jewish lawyer in hiding, yelled, "I've been hit." 2 Russian soldiers jumped in among us and set up their gun behind the small cannon's armored cover. I tried to pull St. Mikloshi out of the machine gun fire. Someone crawled up beside us and helped. The Russians had already taken down a door and were bringing it to lay the wounded man on. The officer, who had previously been gesturing wildly, looked at poor St. Mikloshi with a shock and a certain amount of guilt. 4 of us tried to lift the door, but it was certainly heavy. We took turns every 10 meters, but in the end we managed to carry it into our cellar. My wife was skilled in treating wounds. She took off his shoe and bandaged his ankle. It was an ankle wound. Meanwhile, I noticed that 2 older boys who had been there with the cannon had not returned.
László Szabó,
39 years old, writer.
Buda, District 2, Newell Street. German and Hungarian soldiers are huddled together in the dark hallway, around the dead radio. All communication is cut off. The shelter has been empty since dawn. At 11, a messenger arrives. I can clearly hear the order from behind the curtain: hold the section between Colonel Street, Filler Street, and Italian Boulevard. I feel a bit dizzy. Colonel Street is below us. We've been saved. By noon, the house is empty. We're in no man's land. Occasionally, a soldier wanders in, looking for a firing position, recognizes the situation with a glance, and runs off senselessly. The afternoon is very quiet. I look back at the woodshed. The dead man lies next to a barred door, his calloused heel, his yellow shin sticking out from under the bloody military coat. I call the fireman, and we drag him out of the shelter and onto the snow. At that moment, a few bullets whiz past our heads. We should have known. The shelter opens towards Colonel Street. Since noon, we've been a German target. The evening is also quiet. A piece of paper is fluttering at the gate. Sparrows are jumping on the snowy steps.
Neseu László,
15 years old. Buda, District 1, Mészáros Street 32.
I've completely ruined my stomach from the fried dough cooked in engine oil. We were given the oil from the mechanics as if it were cooking oil. Eva's foot is badly frostbitten. Everyone has some ailment. Most of the group is lousy. There's hardly any water to drink. One of the wounded, who had recovered, was sent to guard duty. The poor fellow was shot.
Gyula literati lóc.
23-year-old First Lieutenant Margaret Island.
By morning, it was clear that the Russians would reach the connecting bridge between the Margaret Island and Margaret Bridge the following night, and we would all be captured. Soviet mortar and artillery fire occasionally hit the Soviet troops. In the afternoon, the order finally arrived to evacuate the island. As the only motorized unit, we were the first to leave the island. Due to the full moon, we covered the tractors and guns with white sheets, and at 8 p.m., I began the retreat. We could only move at a walking pace, and due to the completely bombed-out bridge surface, it took more than 3 hours for the 4 vehicles with 3 guns to reach the Buda bank without loss. When the last German left the island around midnight, they couldn't blow up the bridge due to the damaged fuses. To ensure the work of the bridge builders, a squad under the command of a lieutenant sneaked back onto the island. When they were at the connecting bridge section, the bridge suddenly blew up. Only one Ukrainian volunteer from the squad survived, falling into the large unfrozen hole next to the island where the hot spring water flowed into the Danube. Wounded, he crawled on the Danube ice to Buda.
Gábor Stélo.
Continuation of the same day.
As evening approached, before it got dark, the Soviet soldiers ordered all the men upstairs. The youngest was sent back, and then we were lined up. It was dark, only the stars illuminated the Laurentfay Street leading to Filaire Street. Everything was quiet, nothing moved, only occasionally a gunshot would pierce the silence. We stopped for a moment in front of the Ernie Villa. There stood a large cannon. Our escorts and the cannon's guards were whispering, gesturing for us to be quiet. Our small group was again told with hand gestures to push the cannon out into the street and then up the hill. We tried to explain that it was too heavy for us, but they wouldn't budge, so we set to work. The cannon creaked and groaned, the snow crunched under its iron wheels, and we encouraged each other. That's when I realized how steep Filaire Street really was. Finally, we reached the top. There, the soldiers anchored the cannon, and we were lined up in twos and sent off. But not home, but down the hill, towards the rear lines. Along the way, they rounded up some people from the neighboring villas. We walked towards the valley. It was a beautiful, quiet, cold winter night, and the walk would have been pleasant if not for the uncertainty and worry about the women and children left in the cellar. Somewhere around Guyon Richard Street, they led us to an old, dilapidated villa. Its fence was gone, and a large open space stretched out in front of it. The building must have been the headquarters of the front section because there were many soldiers moving around, and several groups like ours were standing in the area. Perhaps this would be the first screening station for civilian prisoners. A few people were taken into the house, then more, and those who returned said that they had been questioned inside about whether there were any soldiers and what they were doing at the front. When my turn came, I was taken to a civilian who found my Finnish knife hanging from my belt suspicious. I gestured that it was for cutting bread, but he looked very doubtful. I later regretted not mentioning my occupation, but I thought he wouldn't care. I only found out later that priests were treated exceptionally well, so we wore our Luther coats wherever we went, as it guaranteed free movement. Finally, they escorted us out to join the others. There must have been about 100 of us by then. We started moving quietly, sometimes walking, sometimes stopping. We were tired and sleepy. We walked silently beside each other. Eventually, we stopped near the film studio buildings in Passaretti, and they led us to the courtyard of a restaurant where we could settle in the rooms. I ended up in a room with the boys. We tried to huddle on the floor near the wall. Rak Andrash, his younger brother, and a boy named Diamant were around me. A little further away was the engineer, whose wife we had buried, and the old caretaker. A dim candle flickered in the room. In its light, I saw some jars sealed with waxed paper on top of a cupboard. That could only be tomatoes. That's how my wife puts them up. That's how my mother does it. That's how they do it in every household. I was incredibly hungry and thirsty. I whispered to the kids, "Aren't you hungry?" "Of course," they replied. I whispered to one of them, I see a jar of tomato preserves on top of the cupboard. There are about 3 jars. Bring it down. The boy crawled up and took the jars down. I gave one to the 2 younger ones. We older ones shared the other, and the 2 kids got the 3rd one again. I still remember the good taste of those tomatoes.